point.
Yeah.
I don't believe we said that if you're going to do a shuttle-derived vehicle, you might as well extend the shuttle.
That's exactly.
It's the other way around. If you were going to extend the shuttle, then the only heavy lift option that makes sense is the shuttle-derived vehicle.
Well, it seems to me there's a case for the other as well, in the sense that for continuity of workforce, of facilities, it's a stronger case the direction you made it, but it seems to me there's a case.
It might also make sense to have a shuttle-derived vehicle and not extend shuttle. I mean, I think all of those are in the space right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, Sally.
Okay, could I have the first slide? I think it's fair to say that our review group drew the short straw, and I drew the shortest by having to actually give this presentation. But the first thing that I want to do is implicate my co-conspirators here. So the team that has actually spent an enormous amount of time over the last 5 or 6 days is myself, Professor Crawley, Jeff Grayson, and Bo. We've been working very, very closely with the team from Aerospace Corporation, which was leading the costing exercise. They're our independent assessment arm, and they're here just to make sure that we've got a nice arm's length from NASA. Having said that, I think we all recognized, Aerospace certainly recognized, and we recognized that without close collaboration with NASA, the data that they were putting into the costing models would immediately be suspect. So we formed a not small team, a large team from Aerospace, and an even larger and geographically widely dispersed group from NASA that have spent a lot of good quality time getting to know each other over the last few days. And what I'm going to explain is a little bit of a work in process, as you'll see. But the first thing that I need to do is thank everybody, particularly the people from Aerospace and the people from NASA, who have been putting in the extraordinarily long hours over the last 5 days. And it's literally been, I mean, literally 24/7 since last Wednesday late afternoon. Next slide. So let me go through our timeline and process just to give you a sense of what we've been going through here. Ed briefed the 7 scenarios, which we've expanded somewhat, but he rebriefed again just now on last Wednesday, about 160 hours ago. So this is not has not got a long shelf life here. The committee members finalized most of the ground rules and the assumptions that would go into this costing exercise through a series of long discussions on Thursday night and culminating in discussions late Friday. And then from last Thursday through, I've got on the chart very late last night. It turns out I was optimistic in that chart. The last chart actually came in about an hour ago. So this is late breaking news. The Aerospace ran a costing model for all the scenarios and the derivatives that we identified. And these were based on a variety of different launch vehicles, as you've heard from Ed, and different assumed funding levels, as you'll see as we go forward here. We had a variety of different telecons and other discussions, a lot of them 3 hours or more, every day since Thursday, between the committee members, Aerospace, and the NASA team. Many tens of people on these telecons to review the iterations of the output and to validate the data that was going into these models, resolve any issues, and we had many robust debates between committee members, between Aerospace and NASA, between any combination of people you can name in this group to get to where we are today. Next slide. So today's product is significantly better than when we started 160 hours ago. But as I said, it's a bit of a work in progress. And I suspect that coming out of the day, we'll actually be asked to refine certain areas of the analysis to try to get a little bit better handle on some scenario combinations that we might identify here. Next slide. Let me go through our key ground rules and assumptions, because these are important to understand as we go into looking at the actual costing scenarios. The first is that aerospace used a roughly 1.5 historical risk factor that is based on a history of a broad set of over 77 different NASA programs that has been established by Congressional Budget Office and used by several different groups. They used that 1.15 actually historical risk factor on all the element development costs of all scenarios on the cost left to go in those scenarios. We agreed on a lower historical risk of 1.25 for the production of elements and also on the operations costs. And it turns out that 1.25 vice 1.5 for operations actually made a very, very large difference, which was interesting to me, and something that I'm going to go back and try to understand a little bit more. The second on the list is that we elected to add an additional $200 million. This is a one-time add to the COTS cargo baseline in FY11, and this is really intended to incentivize the current COTS cargo demonstrations. We've all come to realize how important the COTS cargo is to the future of ISS, and we want to make sure that there's incentive for them to perform as we all hope they will. The next one, except for the current international agreements that are assumed for ISS and an extension of those same agreements out through 2020, all the elements in all the scenarios were fully costed. And we did this just to make sure that we captured the full costs of the scenarios. In other words, we didn't take credit if we thought that we could engage international partners to help defray some of the costs or take on the costing of some of the elements. We thought that it was premature to do that, and it was better to get the full cost at the very beginning of this process. Next, for each of the scenarios, with the exception of the program of record, we felt it was very, very important to introduce a specific technology line. And we started that technology program at $500 million in FY11. We ramped it up to $1.5 billion a year over a 5-year period, and then we maintained it at $1.5 billion a year for the rest of the time that we considered. As we looked a little bit more closely at this, we realized that there was a possibility for a little bit of double counting in the technology that we wanted to account for, both in the additions that we've made to the ISS program as it's extended, and also in the existing EMSD lines, the exploration lines. So the funding level that we actually put in, as I said, all scenarios except the program of record, which we're using as a baseline, actually ramp from $250 million up to $750 million to help avoid the double counting that we think is in the budget. But the intent is to have a very robust technology program that, in aggregate, will be about $1.5 billion a year. Next. For all the scenarios that assume commercial crew to LEO, and you'll see that is, in fact, most of the scenarios now, we assume $2.5 billion in NASA investment over the 4 years ranging from FY11 through 14. And that is to make sure that, as Bo said, we have a robust competition in which all those who are interested and eligible to compete and to participate will. As we feel that this is very important. We would like to be able to get NASA out of the business of getting people to low Earth orbit, and we think that if we're going to be serious about this, we have to put some money into the budget to do that. So that line is in every scenario where commercial crew to LEO is foreseen.
Can I add one quick one on that one?
Please.
That line item is intended to be sufficiently large that multiple well-funded competitors will come to the table so that we don't have to try to pick the winner up front. We can use the COTS-like model of funding several of them and picking whichever ones wind up being there.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why that looks like a large number compared to the cargo. It also included a significant line item for going through, I hesitate to say human rating, but an enhanced mission assurance process for some existing booster that would be made available as one of the options for all the capsule providers, so that they don't have, so that if we get new capsules but no new booster, we still get the capability.
Thank you. The next one is that we'd use Aerospace's existing contract termination restart model and the actual contract termination costs in the Constellation programs. Next one is that for all the scenarios that include refueling, we're assuming that the technology line actually funds that development. So there's one example of a technology that we would foresee coming out of that technology line. And we also add $1 billion, just a one-time infusion to certify the fuel transfer kit. The next one is that for all sorties that are that assume the lunar, for all scenarios that assume lunar sorties and outpost, we're actually using the Constellation estimate for the Altair lander and the lunar surface systems, just because we didn't want to try to develop costs around other systems. For the deep space options, we're assuming a commercial lunar lander, but we're assuming government-furnished ascent stage. This is just because when you get to putting numbers into budget models, you just have to specify a number for everything. So we're trying to tell you the work that we had to go through here. Next slide.
Sally, excuse me, where you said you used the Altair model, that was adjusted, I assume, by Aerospace?
Yes.
Their factors?
Yes, yes. And I'll get to that in just a second, but thank you, Norm. For all the options that use commercial heavy lift launch vehicles, we're costing them as if NASA doesn't build the system. So this is a commercial buy, and we use NASA infrastructure and the NASA workforce only when it's required to conduct the operations. And we'll have more on that in a minute. The next one is that for shuttle derived scenario, we're assuming side mount costs, but the shuttle derived system scenario is intended to be a surrogate for a side mount or an inline, a very closely shuttle derived system. Again, we needed to put in numbers from someplace, and that's the set of numbers that we put in, but it's a surrogate. As for the current program elements, the shuttle and the station, for all scenarios that envision the ISS deorbiting in 2016, we assumed an additional $1.5 billion cost beyond what's currently in NASA's budget for the decommissioning. That is based on an independent aerospace study looking at, very quick study, but looking at an estimate of the order of magnitude job that it would be to deorbit this very large and very impressive structure. For any scenarios that contemplate just flying out the existing shuttle manifest, as we've discussed, we're assuming that that a more prudent fly-out scenario that would take the current manifest out to March of 2011. Next one.
Sally, before Mayor,
please.
On this, just a question on this, for options using ELV heavy lift vehicles, cost as if NASA does not build system and NASA infrastructure and workforce only when required to conduct the operations. NASA doesn't build today's systems. NASA didn't build previous system. Contractors build it. I was one of those guys, So to say that this is something new is really not all that accurate. NASA has always been the architect of the system, has been partner in the design. They had the so-called subsystem engineers who were guys who knew, you know, the technical aspects of the various subsystems. But the building of the vehicles was always done by contractors. So I'm just cautioning all of us so we don't think like we are like creating some kind of a drastically new scenario here. I think we are talking about how you acquire the contractors will be building things just like they always have in the past.
You know, in part that's true.
We are buying it differently, is that correct?
We're buying differently, and this was shorthand to just say, as is going to hit us hard in the face in one of these charts coming up later, and we know that you're going to comment on, Bo. We're doing one of these scenarios in a very different buy model. And that is all that we're trying to capture here, was the intent that we need to do, that we have done work around trying to identify what that model is. So we're going to see the implications of that model and more detail about what we mean by it I'm hoping that I get pulled off the stage before I get to that one, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Sorry, before you jump
please.
into the numbers, can I just, you already kind of stated it, well, you stated it in your charts, and so did Ed, but I just want to make it clear that in the options that or the scenarios we're talking about using commercial for access to LEO, we're talking about, no, we're still going to use Orion for exploration, but it's the LEO vehicles are the new ones that we're going to be developing. So I just want to make sure that's clear.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. We'll see that Orion line in all of the budget charts, but it's absolutely true. We're planning to use Orion as the exploration vehicle, but commercial crew to LEO would be with a commercial capsule and a commercial, you know, whatever the commercial entities think is a good solution. I should also probably, before I start talking to this, this first little reminder of the budget situation chart, that we've got a whole variety of scenarios here. We've talked about this before. Some of the scenarios and some of the elements within the different scenarios are much more mature than others in terms of their definition, the fidelity of their costing. That's something that we had to deal with head on and try to understand and try to level the playing field. It's very difficult to do when you're dealing with some things that are close to reality and have at least been through a preliminary design review, and other things that are, as I think Ed has certainly said, you know, it's like they're like paper rockets. So we spent a fair amount of time trying to make sure that we were using a level playing field, as level as we could make it in this assessment. And I want to make it also clear that all of these scenarios were handled by aerospace through their costing models using the same formulation, the same methodology. So we understand that there are risks in comparing you know, my rocket with your view graphs. But that's, you know, I want to make the point that we tried as hard as we could to level the playing field here and be able to make reasonable comparisons. So the chart that we've got up now is actually, it's a chart that you've seen before. I showed it in Houston, I think, and I think it's been shown at least one other time. This is just a very quick reminder of how we got to where we are. The top line is the money that was anticipated for the Constellation program when the vision for space exploration was adopted. You know, things happened over time. The second line was the FY09 run out of the budget for the exploration program. The fiscal 10 budget that we are asked to fit to is the third line down, the orange line, and that shows you that quite significant additional reductions were taken just in going from the FY09 budget to the FY10 budget. And by the way, it's important to remember again that the FY10 budget runout assumes that ISS is deorbited in 2016. So if you want to extend ISS, then the money that you're presumably taking away from the exploration program is also fairly significant, and that's that green line. So it's perhaps no surprise that we're where we are. A program that was envisioned to be funded at the top line on that chart is now facing a budget, the bottom line of the chart, and that's a significant amount of money that's been taken out of the entire program over a relatively short period of time. And if you just take a look at the difference between the top line and the green line right at the end of the chart, that's an average of about $3 billion a year difference. So it's not a small difference that we're talking about. Next slide.
Sally, because of the amount of detail here, I think we better ask questions as we go along, if that's all right with you.
Please, it's please.
The question I wanted to ask, I've been chasing this, and maybe you've got it nailed down. This top line on anticipated funding, my question is the authenticity of that line. Was that a NASA want, or was that something approved by the President and the Congress? What's its authority?
You know, I have frankly forgotten the answer to that question. I think that it is more than NASA's ask, but it may be less than the FY06 budget. But the original funding for the budget was quite a bit higher than the FY09 budget.
We need to nail that down.
We do.
Sally, it's only a little worse than this, because I think that at this point it's worth once again stating that the numbers that we're going to show for the budget are the analysis from the aerospace, which will include the historical growth factors for costs over and above the costs that have historically been carried and reported by NASA in the program. So that not only are we trying to fit under the green line rather than, well, even only a few months ago under the red line, but that we're doing it with what we think are much more historically valid, maximum likely estimated costs of the program.
I'll actually agree with that, but give NASA a little bit of credit here, because as you'll see, we've got a case that somewhat serendipitously fits the program of record to what we've called a less constrained budget, that it turns out is actually rather similar to that top line. And it's pretty darn close to what NASA planned the Constellation program to, and the program comes pretty close to performing as NASA advertised it would, even with that 1.5 historical risk put in. So what that means is that NASA's planning in the development of the development phase of the Constellation program was actually pretty good. I think that we've almost re-derived how they came up with the costs that they came up with, and we'll see that chart in a little while.
But you understand that I'm trying to emphasize this point because there are some people in Washington, for example, the Congressional Budget Office, who have argued that there are historical cost growths in NASA programs, and that we think that we've used an appropriate, well, we're trusting the input of the Aerospace Corporation, that we've used an appropriate expectation multiple already in these numbers.
Mm-hmm. And it's not a bad idea to take just another minute to talk about that multiple. You know, as I said, the Congressional Budget Office did an assessment of 77 NASA programs that ranged from, you know, relatively small robotic programs up to very large human programs, and looked at the average cost overrun and came up with this, you know, factor of 1.51. And they also looked at it from over the lifetime of the program, the program from PDR till the end of the program, the time from CDR to the end of the program, et cetera. So it was a reasonably complete analysis, came up with that 1.51. I think the first question that occurred to a lot of us was, well, wait a minute, that included a lot of small robotics programs. What would it look like if you did it just with the human programs? And it turns out that in that case, it's a factor of 2, not a factor of 1.51. So, that made me believe that, the historical risk is probably a very, very valuable thing to put in because, I think as one of our NASA colleagues said earlier, stuff happens, and it just always does. And some of it you can plan for, and some of it you put reserves in for, but history shows that that stuff gets you.
The problem, of course, with this is that if you're a program manager, you're damned by your predecessors. And on the other hand, if you're going to Las Vegas, this is the way to bet.
Yeah,
And
that's right. And I think that Wanda made the point in seeing this chart and talking about the 1.5 when we're just having a brief discussion, that often when the stuff happens, you might, and stuff has just happened, well, you might slip the schedule, or you might thin down the content a little bit in order to meet the schedule. So there are things that a program manager does to try to manage this.
Sally, let me just add one other point to that, which I think we've touched on in the past, which is it doesn't do you a lot of good to get the dollars later either, sort of adding more dollars at the end, which is, sort of the argument that we get into, which is that in future years, the money will be there and we'll be able to execute that. That's fraught with, additional risk and additional cost in order to do the program then in an unoptimum way.
Absolutely.
And one more thing
Next
to
slide.
add, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
Norm, just to provide a little bit of clarification on this top line and why it's so difficult for you to get that nailed down. And I have to be very careful when I speak here because the budget is something that's, it's a lot of intense discussion about that. But officially, the president's budget only goes out for 5 years. So when we got the ESAS, when NASA got the ESAS budget in 2004, 2005, officially, the only thing that was agreed to by all parties was for a 5-year period out to 2010. Beyond that, it gets into assumptions at what the inflation rate is, assumption at what other factors that go into those out years, and that sort of gets negotiated at the staffer level. So it's even inaccurate to say the president's budget request and put a line out that far. It's really just 5 years, and then after that it becomes assumption. So that's why it's very difficult to answer that question clearly. It's what we thought we had, what parties thought they gave us, and what thought was agreed to. It's not really official except that 5-year budget.
But that's very bad news because if in 2004 you had the next 5 years, that would say in 2009 the only thing you were assured of was the first point on the blue line, which just about is where the green line is today. So it says we're just about where we were then.
That's correct.
Yep.
And so everything above that was wish list.
Yep. Next slide. Very quickly, let me run through the methodology that aerospace used for, again, all of the scenarios. They built up the budget charts for a particular scenario. They didn't constrain that. Didn't constrain the budget. They just built up the pieces. Then in step 2, they fit those scenario costs to a given budget, perhaps the FY10 constrained budget that we were given to work for, as an example. And they used schedule as the independent variable and just deterministically let the schedule fall where it would. Then they allocated funding and reserves to raise the total program cost to about 65% likelihood of meeting that cost. Then in step 3, they went through Monte Carlo analysis to take a look at the impact of the technical and historical risks on the actual execution of this scenario. And so that is how we got the results that we've got. So next slide. Let's start talking about budgets. The first one we're going to take a look at is the program of record. This is sort of our derived baseline here. This is the program of record, the existing constellation program and its budget. We're taking the realistic shuttle flyout to March 2011 because we just think that that's a very prudent thing to do. And we're assuming ISS retirement in early 2016, which the program of record assumes. And the commercial and international engagement is as it is in the current program. Next slide. This is what it looks like. This is the unconstrained budget. If I could see the small print in each of those lines of sand, I'd let you know what they are. But as you can see, each different color represents an element of the program. So the bottom light green is Orion. I think the next one up is Ares 1. The next blue line up is Ares 5. Then I think we've got ground operations, probably Altair next in the dark green, light green. Thank you, Leroy.
Other CX elements, lunar surface systems in yellow, and then other non-CX elements in orange.
Thanks.
And then you've got the dark, and towards the left is ISS, towards the left again is Shuttle.
Right, and you'll see that ISS, the shuttle extends only out to 2011, and then there are some termination retirement costs. ISS is terminated in early 2016. So this is what all the charts that you're going to see are going to look like. These are going to start blending together after a while. But the format is going to be consistent. I think even the color scheme is consistent. The lines at the top show particular milestones, shuttle retirement, ISS retirement. The red lines are showing capabilities coming online. So in the unconstrained budget, Orion and Ares 1 arrive shortly after ISS is deorbited. And then you get human lunar return in, I think that's 2021. Thank you, Leroy. So this is in the unconstrained budget. And then the thing to look at is how much above the budget that we are supposed to be fitting to it is. That budget is the black dashed line that goes all the way across at roughly $9 billion a year, if you want to try to find that black line. So this shows you in a given year how many billions of dollars over that budget this unconstrained program of record would be. Next slide.
Sally, before you move on, this is a truly excellent slide to point out graphically what we've talked about verbally.
Yeah.
Which is the focus tends to be very much on what do these systems take to develop. But the really dominant effect is you look out at the right part of the chart and you discover that we are on a path right now for a system that requires on the close order of double the current budget just to operate.
Mm-hmm. That's the steady state numbers you can see. You're kind of approaching steady state there out in 2028 or so, and that's the operation.
If Santa Claus brought us this system tomorrow, fully developed, and the budget didn't change, our next action would have to be to cancel
it. Yeah.
And Sally, could you give us an estimate as to the integral between the top line and the sort of dashed line?
Let's see. Leroy, is that?
49.
Yeah, so it looks like the integral FY10 through 30 is 307 billion.
No, just above, what's just above the dash line? What's the overages?
So the dash, let's see. The dash, let me give you out through 2020 because I know that, okay? 2020, the integral under the dashed line is 99.2 billion.
Okay.
That's not on the chart. And then you can look here that it's 149, so it's 50 billion over out to 2020.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Next slide. All right. This one is going to be the fit of this program to the president's budget. So now aerospace is now doing another set of runs that will essentially squash and push to fit this program into the budget that we have been asked to meet, that we've been asked to fit things to. So we're still assuming the flyout in March of 11, ISS retirement in 2016. Next slide. Okay, so that's what it looks like. And, you know, it's a computer, so you can do anything you want. You can actually make a chart like this that fits the budget. But if you take a look at this budget, you can see that, that there are a few things wrong with it. One is that you get, again, Orion and Ares 1 capability of crew to LEO a couple years after ISS is gone, so there's nothing for Ares 1 and Orion to go to. You do get a heavy lift out in 2028, but you'll notice that there are no lunar systems that have been developed. There was not enough money to even start the lunar systems. So you have a heavy lift vehicle in 2028, but absolutely nothing to put in it to send it to the moon. So this says it pretty well. You cannot do this program on this budget. And it's just back to Norm's basic message. You know, if you want to do something, you have to have the money to do it. This chart, and actually several of, as we started doing a lot of runs on a lot of these different scenarios, we kept coming up with a common theme, which was this budget is very, very, very hard to fit with and still have an exploration program. In fact, we are still looking for an existence proof that we can actually find one. So we haven't found one yet, but we're still looking. We've only been working on this for 160 hours. Because of that, we decided that we needed to ask a slightly different question. We needed to say, well, what if we tried to fit it to something that was a less constrained budget? So next slide. We tried to fit the program of record to a less constrained budget. It's the same thing. And go on to the next slide. This is what we chose as the less constrained budget. We had quite a discussion about what budget line to choose. We decided to kind of split the difference, and we didn't want to make that budget line too small because then we were afraid that we'd not be able to accomplish any exploration. We didn't want to make it too large because then we'd just be laughed off the stage. So we chose the red line that you can see there. It ramps up slowly to $3 billion a year over the budget that we've been given. And then it stays at a constant $3 billion a year over that budget out until 2020. And then we allow that red line to grow with inflation at a rate of 2.4% per year. Now that's important because the run-out budget that we've been given grows at inflation at an inflation rate of only 1.4% per year all the way out to 2030. So you can immediately understand the problems that the program is in trying to fit that budget. Every year you go, you have less buying power than you had the year before if inflation was actually greater than 1.4%. Next slide. So this is the Constellation program, the program of record fit to the less constrained budget. And this one, you know, again, this is a computer, so you can always fit these things into whatever budget you want, and the schedule kind of falls out. And this turns out to be a fairly reasonable program. Ares 1 and Orion arrive in late 2016. That's not too much of a delay. It's after ISS has been deorbited. So again, there's nothing for them to service, but they're there not too far behind schedule. You get human lunar return in 2025. And now this is the chart that you can use to envision. Turns out that red line is pretty close to the envisioned ESAS, the envisioned program at the time of the Vision for Space Exploration. So this is fairly close to the budget that Constellation thought it was going to have. At least to first order, it's within that. And if you think we're kind of almost 5 years beyond that, and this slips human lunar return almost 5 years, you can see that the Constellation program did a pretty reasonable job of projecting and estimating with the budget that they were working under. Next slide. So that's the program of record and what it looks like. Now I want to talk about some of the new scenarios, and I think that fitting the program of record to the FY10 President's budget and the run-out guidance that we've been given, that shows you, again, that's the why are we here slide. That's the what's the reason for this committee. The program of record doesn't fit under the current budget, so we have to be looking at different scenarios. So now let's start looking at some of the scenarios that Ed has described. For all of these scenarios that follow, we added the technology line that I described. We added the additional $200 million for COTS cargo that I described. All that envision commercial crew to LEO, we've added the $2.5 billion between 11 and 14. The next set of scenarios are the ones that we thought actually had a chance to fit under the constrained budget, the FY10 budget. So these are the ones that on Ed's chart showed fit to FY10 budget. Those two are the ISS, the ones we called ISS focused, and the one we called dash out of LEO. Now again, all of these have gone through the same assessment process by Aerospace Corporation using the methodology that I just very briefly outlined, and working with the NASA teams to get the costing of the elements and the assumptions. Next one. So first, let's look at ISS focused. This is with commercial crew to LEO. I should say that we first ran this case assuming Ares 1, and under these budget constraints, it was not able to get to ISS and service ISS until about a year left in its life. So I don't remember what year it came in. It might have been 2019 or so with an ISS extension out to 2020. It was very obvious with the first run that the Ares 1 in this, as part of this scenario, just didn't work. And so we switched over to the commercial, not switched over, we were going to do that one anyway, but we're just showing the commercial crew to LEO. So this scenario, we just, our focus is primarily on ISS in this decade, fit to the FY10 budget, shuttle flyout in March 11, ISS is extended into 2020, and we're trying to foster the commercial and international engagement. We haven't taken any credits for international participation, but we did put the money in for commercial crew to LEO. Next slide. This is what it looks like when it's constrained to budget. I've actually got these, thanks. So it fits. The commercial crew, we have getting there in mid-2016 to support ISS. You need to buy a couple of extra Soyuz flights to make up that time. But the commercial crew to LEO can support ISS. This does include the technology program. But look at what happens to exploration in this. We tried to keep some, the whole point of our work is to try to develop a strategy for human exploration. And so we did not want to just throw away exploration, but see what happened to it in this scenario. And it essentially disappears. You get Ares 5 and Orion in 2028, so you get a heavy lifter. But you, again, were unable to afford even starting the lunar surface systems. So again, If you're willing to wait till 2028, you've got a heavy lift vehicle, but you've got nothing to lift. Because of this problem with this particular scenario, we just didn't like this. This is a don't do anything different, and don't start an exploration program because it doesn't make sense. You'd never design a program this way. We actually decided to look at this scenario under the less constrained case, the different budget that I described. So that's the next slide.
Sally?
Yes.
Before you leave this, I think this chart, just another way of saying what you just said about you really wouldn't do this, is to look at the blue slug in the next decade. That although there's a broad political consensus, I think, around town, and there's, I think, some consensus on our panel that there are various reasons why it's desirable to extend the ISS, that if you try and do it within this budget, it essentially is the budget other than the other sustaining engineering functions of NASA for the next decade.
Yeah, that's is probably about a third of the budget, actually. Although we may have squashed it and squished it a little bit, but in our scenarios, if you think of it as about $3 billion a year plus a little bit extra for transportation.
Let me be more precise, which is that the combination of the keeping alive of the NASA infrastructure and the operation of the ISS
Yes.
Essentially eats up the budget
Yes.
for the decade.
Yes, that's right.
Can I footnote that? I think I feel as strongly as the other members of the group do that technology development is critical. But have we increased it so much and so fast that we're eating up all the other options? I guess I'm talking about the size, not the principle.
Yeah, we'd get about
I don't think the thing
750.
that's eating up all the other options is the technology budget.
No, but
Right.
it's helping. If you look at this, if you cut the technology budget in half, you still have $750 million.
Well, not
No,
really.
the line in here,
Well, you've got the other half up in the
375.
ISS, so it's
It'd be
really
375.
three-quarters.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, we're only actually in this budget exercise only pricing the $1.5 billion technology program at $750
yeah,
at $750 million.
$750 million, right.
But, I strongly support the point here, but I guess I'm trying to be the devil's advocate. If I were a green eye shade person, I'd look at that big blue spot there and say, you're gold watching me here.
Well, let me frame the question. Let me frame the choices, the policy choices. And this is a theme that's going to recur several times. If you don't like what you're doing, if you don't like what you're getting for your money, you can either spend more money or you can change the price of things over time, which is essentially what research and development is about. Or you can turn some other things off. And the other things are the other 60% of the budget, the various fixed costs. Those are your choices. And so if you don't invest in technology and you don't like today's picture and you don't turn anything off, then when the next commission gets up 10 years from now,
I've been there, done that.
the situation won't look any better.
But Jeff's still young, so.
Yeah, the Greasing Commission, 2019. Okay, I give up.
Well, but there are hybrids to each one of these options, of course, Norm, that you could run. We picked these, or they were picked because they were representative, differentiationable, if that's a word. But certainly there's some tweaks and hybrids that you could generate on a lot of these.
Okay, I just
Yeah.
want to make that point. So Sally,
Yeah.
please.
Next slide. So this is fitting the same ISS-focused commercial crew to LEO to the less constrained budget. And here you actually can begin to fund the lunar surface programs. Again, we're not saying that this is exactly how you would run this program, but we've got a bit of an existence proof here that at least within this budget, you can get back to the moon by, in this case, 2030. You get Orion and the heavy lifter in about 2023. As I think, Phil just mentioned, you can do the mixing and matching here. We just kind of matched this ISS focused to, kind of almost a program of record, sort of a lunar, not program of record, but a lunar sortie outpost ending. If you wanted it to be a little bit less expensive and maybe do a little bit more in the decade of the 20s, you might match it up with the deep space option, which we'll see is a little bit more cost effective. Okay, next one. Let's go on to dash out of Leo.
Sally, before you leave ISS, I'm sorry, I got one more. I'm trying to nail down exactly what the ISS cost is. And on your chart number 7, as I do a optical integration under that, it looks like it's about 10 billion, whereas, or 9 billion. We said it was 14. Can we call up chart 7 and see if there's something wrong with it, or if I've just can't integrate?
Which,
The difference between the orange and the green, there it is. The difference between the orange and the green line looks like it's around 9 billion.
This is the difference between before and after the 1.5 and the difference between then year and constant year.
right.
Say that again?
Well,
In English.
I'm sorry. This curve, which was drawn some time ago, would have put in the factors in uninflated dollars.
That's right.
And at a minimum, the one that Sally just showed is an inflated
For
dollars.
ISS extension.
And we would have to go back and look at what historical risk factor was assigned to the ISS in the out years.
So we need to update this chart.
It's a historic.
Well, it's a
Well,
historical
the ISS
chart.
extension wouldn't be a historical chart.
Yes, to be consistent
that's
with
a good
the
point.
subsequent data we would.
I
have
think that that this was probably just done assuming ISS at the current kind of very minimal utilization level, which I believe that we've agreed in
Right.
previous meetings is if you're going to keep running this thing, you don't want to run it at this at the level where it can't actually do anything.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
want to increase the utilization by a few $100 million a year.
I think it's important, the other numbers I think have done it correctly, right, with the 1.5 and all, but here, the situation is much worse than this summary chart makes it look really.
It's the danger of trying to show an expense on a budget chart.
Right.
Which is what we tried to do.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, let's update that line.
Okay.
Got it, thank you.
Okay. Let's see, can we go
You mean in-
back to, thank you. Oops.
I think you were on 19, 20. 20.
Yeah. All right, good. Dash out of Leo was our other hope for matching the constrained budget, staying within the constrained budget. The point here was to get out of low Earth orbit as soon as possible and actually make it somewhere. We used the deep space option as our destination, set of destinations. Again, we've got the shuttle flyout in March of 2011, ISS deorbit in early 2016, so all of our money here is going to exploration as soon as possible. We've moved out the lunar surface program a little bit in the future on this one. Next slide. Okay, so this is what the dash out of Leo looks like. And we've actually now renamed this, and we have our favorites. When we first started the runs, I thought that this looked more like a saunter out of Leo. Then, as we looked at it more closely, it turns out that it's much more of a trudge out of Leo. You essentially don't get, you just don't get there. The message is you get the heavy lift vehicle in 2028, but you lose the ability to make it even to a near-Earth object. You lose the lunar lander. So you just, you thought you were designing something that would put all your efforts on getting out of low Earth orbit. But again, I think here's where Jeff would make the point that the the fixed costs, the carrying costs of of the infrastructure that you've got are kind of killing you and keeping you from really getting going and developing the systems that you need. Now, again, we didn't try to optimize this. We've only had time to iterate these a certain number of times, but you don't have to look too long to say you would not run a program this way. That this budget is simply not friendly to exploration, and it's actually very, very difficult to, as I said at the beginning of these, it's very difficult to find an exploration scenario that actually fits within this very restrictive budget guidance that we've been given.
And Sally, for the public, could you just mention why there's some dips and some overages on this chart? I mean, this one is constrained to the budget.
Yeah.
If people are wondering.
Yeah, this is a little bit. This was a chart that we could get to fit a little bit better given time to do a little bit more tweaking. So the process that goes on here is you first do the unconstrained case, and then you go in by hand and you start moving things around to match the peaks, and then you do the run again, and you see where everything falls out. And in some cases, it's relatively easy to match perfectly. In other cases, when you've got programs starting and stopping and peaks start happening at about the same time, it's a little bit harder. So that's just what's happening in this case. I think it's, in some cases, in fact, this may be the case where you see where it dips below the line, actually twice. We're kind of building up reserves in some of the heavy lift and Beyond LEO programs because there's not quite enough money to start them. And so the reserves just in the model carry over to the next year until you can use them. And then they carry over again till the next year till you can use them. And that's kind of, I think that bump there is actually an artifact of reserves bumping over. So we could, we could work harder and flatten this one to actually constrain to the budget, but it's just not worth the effort. As I said, you would not run your program this way. You'd go back and you'd rethink your whole program before you tried to optimize this one.
Hey, Sally, does this, in this scenario, and I think maybe Ed wants to answer this, are we using dual Aries for this dash out of LEO or single Aries 5 light?
Dual.
Dual. Yeah, it's dual.
Why are we using dual? We don't have a lander, do we?
You choose your heavy lift vehicle.
No, the rationale here was to examine how much progress you could make towards exploration beyond LEO, retiring the space station at the earliest practical time, and using the simplest systems that you could use to get out of LEO.
Right.
So that we retire the space station at 15. We don't build the Ares 1.
That's right.
And we focus on building the Ares 5, and we don't build the lunar surface systems and the lunar lander, and instead we build the, what's it called, in-space.
The in-space.
In-space elements.
In-space elements, in-space habitat.
And we still don't get anywhere until the end of the next decade.
Right.
Well, I was just thinking, would your dashing be a little more graceful if we use a single rocket in this case?
We do use a single.
That's why I asked, is it dual or
Yes,
a
it's
single?
Dual Ares 5 light, that's what we priced in this one. The Ares 5
Two
light.
rockets or one rocket?
One rocket, 2 launches for the mission.
Yeah.
No, actually, we should be careful. That the term is dual Ares 5 because it's a dual launch when used for a lunar piloted mission.
I understand.
But actually in those missions, which don't yet actually start beginning until just after the curve, for many of them, you actually only use a single launch.
Right.
Thank you, that makes sense.
Chris, you had a question.
It's really a comment. This really looks a lot like the program of record fit to the FY10 budget. You give up Ares 1 and you get technology development and beyond LEO capability.
Yeah.
But you get your heavy lift online at the same time you retire the station. I mean, that is comforting that the result's about the same. If you fit within the FY10 budget, you don't do anything before 2028.
Yeah, I mean, there really is a consistent message that comes out of these scenarios, and as you said, I mean, it is a little bit comforting.
So to speak.
Yeah, so to speak. Interesting choice of words.
It's consistently bad.
Yeah. Next slide. All right, so the summary for the constrained cases, we've already said this, but the current budget guidance is very, very, very limiting. And so far, we haven't found a scenario that includes exploration that's viable. It's not to say that it's not out there, but we haven't been able to find it yet. The ISS focused, Ares 1 arrives too late for the ISS. Commercial crew to LEO can support the ISS, but the Ares 5 arrives in 2028 with no lunar surface systems. The dash out of LEO, it isn't. The heavy lift capabilities arrive in 2028. So you can start doing missions with one launch, as Bo said, in 2030 or so. Next slide. Okay, so moving on. We're going to look at the next set, but with that background, it's very clear that the next set of options don't have a chance of fitting into the constrained budget. They're going to look only worse than these ones that we thought had at least some possibility. So for all of this next set, we looked at the less constrained case, that red budget line that I described a little while ago. So the scenarios that we're looking at are the deep space scenarios. We've got 3 different variants of this corresponding to 3 different heavy lift options. Lunar global, the used shuttle systems, which is close the gap, and Norm, that's kind of your blue plate special, and Mars first. Next slide. So moving into the deep space, the assumptions are pretty much what we've been seeing. Shuttle flyout in March 2011, ISS extended, and in all of these scenarios, you'll see that ISS is extended. That we're using dual Ares light vehicles in this. We've got the technology development line. We're using commercial crew to LEO. And our destinations are Lagrange points, near-Earth asteroids, aiming at flybys, Mars flyby. We've deferred the lunar lander and the lunar systems in this case, but that's not to say that this architecture doesn't allow the lunar lander and the lunar systems. They're just deferred, and we would envision the lunar lander and lunar systems being a combination of commercial and government. Next slide. This is what this one looks like. In the less constrained case, these are starting to look a little better. This is the case of the dual Ares 5. You actually have some destinations in the 2020s. You make it to a Lagrange point in 2025, a near-Earth asteroid in 2030. You can do a Mars flyby by 2034. And human lunar return closes. In this case, you can actually do it, and you can do that in 2035. So any questions on this case? This just, you could almost undoubtedly do some optimization around any of these, but with the dual Ares 5, this is what this, and this budget on the order of $3 billion a year above the budget guidance, ramping up to that, but on that order in the out years, this is what you can achieve.
Sally,
Yeah.
Since I haven't seen the adjusted manifest for this yet, do you have some idea of kind of what's the pace of missions? I mean, are you doing a mission every other year or every 3rd year?
Yeah, I think it actually comes out to about every other year. It depends a little bit on the missions, as you know. I haven't seen the detailed manifest yet, but it's once you get going, you can roughly follow the manifest. Okay. Next slide. Now we're moving on to the directly shuttle-derived heavy lift vehicle. This is about a 100 metric ton vehicle, and we're using the shuttle-derived vehicle for cargo only. We're still using commercial crew to LEO for any scenarios that would use a crew capsule. They would presumably be using the Orion, and we'd be launching it with no people on, and then the people would be added in space. Technology development line. Next slide. This is what this one looks like. The shuttle-derived vehicle is a little bit more cost-effective, primarily because it's using the existing infrastructure, and it's pretty well known. Get to Lagrange points in 2023. That's a couple years sooner. Near-Earth asteroids or objects in 2027, a few years sooner. Mars flyby in 2029. Human lunar return in 2030. Next slide. Okay. Now we're moving on to the case of a commercial buy, and this is to be representative of a commercial large, call it 75 metric ton hydrocarbon booster. So all the assumptions are the same, except the booster is different. That for some of the destinations requires additional launches. We've covered that in the manifesting in the scenarios. Next slide. Okay, the thing to say about this slide is that it brings in considerable efficiencies because you're doing business a new way. You're actually you're making a commercial buy out of your heavy lift vehicle. You can see that there's actually once you get ISS retired, you've actually got quite a nice little dip there below the budget, and then it kind of ramps up as you're going into significant operations. But if you just look at these, you get to Lagrange points by 2024, near-Earth objects 2026, Mars flyby 2028, and then human lunar return 2029. Now, it's important here to talk about the disruptions that occur in the effort to get to those efficiencies. So this is a significantly different way of doing business for NASA, and it would significantly disrupt the NASA workforce and the NASA infrastructure. It would require dismantling a not insignificant part of the infrastructure that we've built up over the decades at Kennedy Space Center, at Michoud, at our engine test facilities. So notice the yellow highlighting right in the middle of the graph that says $3 billion for facility shutdown costs. We spent a lot of time discussing how to take into account the costs associated with this disruption. So it's everything from closing down facilities at some ramp down, mothballing facilities, safing facilities, to reducing the civil service workforce by actually, in this case, 3,000 people. So this is not an insignificant change. Even at midnight last night, there was a lot of discussion and calculations going on between the NASA folks and the aerospace folks, primarily the NASA folks just trying to get a handle on the data and interacting actually with Jeff and with me to try to come up with kind of a bound of what these costs are. So we actually have not come to a conclusion yet. The NASA folks, even amongst themselves, have not determined what they think these costs should be. So we're still a ways off. This is not an easy problem to figure this out. So we've actually got a bound, and it's not a small range. We've got this chart at a $3 billion facilities closure and workforce reduction cost. The next chart shows an $11 billion facilities closing and workforce reduction cost taken over the period of around 6 years. So why don't we go to the next chart that shows the effect of that. This you can see that wedge. I think it's the yellow, very pale yellow wedge that shows up there right after the shuttle wedge. So that's kind of how it plays out. So it's not a small part of this thing. You still get to the savings. You get to them a little bit later, and it's not quite as deep once you get there because you got to be kind of making up time. But you do get to the savings in the out years. This does push things out a little bit. The first Lagrange point is 2025. First NEO is 2027. Mars flyby 2029. Human lunar return 2030. So we think with these two cases that we've bounded the closure costs and the disruption. But it is, you shouldn't underestimate the magnitude of the repercussions on this one, because it's very, very difficult to reduce the civil service workforce by 3,000 over, a period of time like this.
Hey, Sal, can I ask a question? Maybe it's more for Ed, but for both of you. I'm just thinking here, if in this scenario, the Orion and RP booster, is that launching unmanned and then the commercial transport rendezvous and docks with it? Mm-hmm. I guess in all these scenarios where we're doing that kind of thing, especially when we're doing that kind of thing, it begs the question, do we need the Orion?
Well, that leads naturally to a point I wanted to raise.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of things I want to say about this, and I'll save some of them for later in the discussion. But one of them is, the least worst scenario that I have been able to spot in terms of fitting to something least far away from the President's guidance budget that still does exploration would be to do this and take the bitter pill, and it's a bitter pill, of radical change in the way that we do business, and take two and call me in the morning. And to also cancel Orion, which would allow you to rescope the size and mass of the capsule in a future procurement to more closely match the transportation infrastructure that you're building up. And then you would delay the acquisition of whatever your Beyond LEO capsule is until after the commercial crew taxi capsules had entered service. So you had a different industrial base in the future than you have today of people who have that recent experience doing those kind of capsules. So it's kind of like you go from Mercury to Gemini. You get a chance to employ lessons learned and try it over again. If you did that, well, and that's one factor. And then the other factor is this double bump appearance. This double bump appearance is a product of a considerable amount of ignorance that we've got about what would the future in the 2025 plus time frame look like, and nobody on the planet knows that. In some sense, the point of purchasing these elements more commercially is to enable there to be innovation and competition among multiple providers. And yet, when we are faced with the prospect of how to cost these things, we have no way to account for that. So this second bump in the 2025 plus time frame is of different character than the high out-year costs in all the other scenarios. This is actually going to the purchasing of incremental costs of more flying hardware. In other words, you can turn this wick up and down in this scenario, which you essentially can't do on all the other scenarios because they're all fixed cost, and this one is dominated by incremental costs. So, and the incremental costs are the ones that we're hoping will come down over time, but we have no idea by how much. So there is a chance, by no means a certainty, and insert Bo's speech, which I completely agree with, about this is a huge radical change in doing business. It's a leap into the unknown. But there is a chance that if you took that set of steps, you'd have something that was somewhere between the president's guidance and the higher number that we're talking about. It still wouldn't fall all the way back down to the line, but it might not be as far above it.
Hey, Sally, you know, this whole wonderful idea how to save money by changing direction. You know, there's a new deal, new direction, new way of doing business. You know, it sounds good. You know, and I'm sure that the older you are, the more of these turns you have lived through. But let me just say a few words. How would we do this? So you actually destroy part of NASA. You get rid of the guys who today participate in mission assurance and also provide independent savvy to contractors. And I was contractors, and I used to have NASA guys, smart guys, looking over my shoulders, make sure that I don't goof up. And God knows I did enough of that. So you'd like to get rid of it. So that scenario would get rid of that. You would abandon what we do well, what we have developed doing well over several decades, and learn what Russians have done well, or buy their product, you know, in terms of propulsion. And most importantly, NASA really doesn't build things. NASA buys things. On these major programs, typically NASA spends in-house about 20%. They buy from contractors about 80%. And somehow you beat up NASA, you push them back. He says, you guys go and do something else or get laid off. And, you know, and turn it over to the guys who today provide 80%, you know, of services and goods for NASA budget. And somehow out of it, you're supposed to come with this huge saving. And I think it just violates common sense in my mind. I think what's going to happen is we will create a havoc that will probably last, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years. You know, there will be, NASA is not, by the way, very easily directable. I've been NASA's contractor forever, so they'll fight, and that fight will create a lot of instability, havoc, and when the dust is finally settled, it could be a decade later, we will wonder, what have we done? And Norm said something today which was very wise, and I clearly agree with it. Stability is important. You know, small deviation from your direction are tolerable. You know, if we think that NASA has too much infrastructure, we ought to make a strong recommendation to NASA, reduce your infrastructure, be a little more effective, efficient. But saying, we are going to do this by telling them, well, first of all, we don't tell anybody anything, we provide options. But provide an option which somebody may think, this is actually a pretty good idea. Get NASA out of this business, create this situation, and hope that at the end you will be doing business at lower cost. And even you guys use this word chance. You really want to provide an option that will leave future of America in space to chance? I don't know. I've got a little problem with that.
Unless more money comes, we don't have a chance, we have a certainty, and the certainty is not good.
If the problem is money, let's try to figure out how to help NASA get more money. You know, let's look at the root cause and not sort of try to work on the side rather than addressing the root cause. In fact, I think what Sally presented, these, you know, slightly increased funding of the $3 billion of years per year, that does miracles to these charts. Several of them look a hell of a lot better, excuse me for my language, by suggesting that maybe the country ought to spend additional $3 billion for NASA programs. But I think we ought to address what problem we are solving. If it's money, well, let's address money. If it's NASA inefficiency or too big an infrastructure, let's address that, but not say, let's scramble what we have done well, get ourselves on these new set of tracks, and take the chance that we will be successful. That's all.
Okay. Chris, do you want to follow that?
This comment may be better placed at the end of Sally's presentation, but I'll toss it in now, inspired by Bo's remarks. I think one thing I'm taking from this is the importance of the question Norm asked earlier about what actually is the integrated shuttle flyout cost from 2015 to 2020, including, I guess, deorbiting at the end of that. The scenarios that at least have us doing something in the 20s are these less constrained scenarios that come in at budgets that are 23 or $25 billion over the budget guidance. And it looks to me like station with this 1.2 multiplier actually accounts for the majority of that addition, the station flyout from 2015 to 2020. Although politics is certainly beyond our competence or job description, there's clearly going to be, I think, a strong political constituency for not dropping station into the ocean in 2016. And one could imagine an understanding in which you extend station as above the budget line. And that might really account for most of this additional budget that would have to be found. So I think just knowing what that number was, and you obviously have the data, it'd be very good to know that number.
Yeah. In fact, that data is in the backup detail that goes with these, that, just arrived at, 4 in the morning, and, our eyes were too bleary to be able to focus on those small line numbers. But we've got the data.
Sally, just a different way of expressing some concern about the optimism expressed by this chart is that as I flip through these, this is sort of one of the better looking ones, the less constrained deep space, right? One of the better looking ones. And yet, as you look at the buildup of costs in this one, it's the one based on, in some senses, the largest number of notional systems. Mm-hmm. And, another truism is that early in the scoping of a system, one tends to be more optimistic about its eventual costs than one is as one gains more experience with it. So, it's the paper rocket versus the real rocket problem reflected here in almost every line. I'm not saying it isn't right, but, you would have more uncertainty about these costs than in some of the other charts we've seen.
I think that's fair. I think there's also an enormous amount of uncertainty actually in all of the charts, because once you get past Orion, which we have a reasonable understanding of, Ares 1, which we have a reasonable understanding of, Ares 5, now light, which is we don't have quite as good an understanding of as Ares 5, but we don't have very good understanding, frankly, of Altair, or any of the systems. So all of these charts suffer from the problem that once you get out past, you choose your favorite date, whether it's 2015 or 2020, there's a lot of, is it fiction or is it uncertainty? And it's true in all the charts. And I think that, as I said, we tried to level the playing field. And I think that once you get out to the 20s, it's really hard to distinguish which ones there's more fiction in or more uncertainty in than others. I actually agree that there is less certainty with some of these scenarios than others, but I think that we're really fooling ourselves if we think that there's a certainty with any of them. So.
Well, I think that's an excellent sort of commentary on the whole process, that we have to, nobody in this committee, I'm sure I already know, and nobody who's looking at these charts today should view them as actual budget charts.
That's exactly right.
They're sort of examinations of what might occur in a budget as a first first order sensitivity. And that's the way I think it's clear that we're viewing them, and that's the way it's clear that anyone else looking at them should view them.
You know, I'd say it even more strongly than that. You know, this methodology and the process that we're going through, it's actually a very good process, and it's very good methodology. And we've had very, very good people from both aerospace and NASA who have been working very hard trying to make it as good as they can. Having said that, each run that you do, you get smarter. And each run that you do requires putting some intelligence into the next run. And until you get to the point where you've done 4 or 5 or 6 runs, even with a given scenario, you haven't kind of leveled out at a good understanding of how the interactions in that scenario work. We're, at best, we've done 2 to 3 runs of these scenarios. Some of them, we haven't even finished the less constrained budget runs. I mean, you're going to see that I'm just about out of the sand charts because we ran out of time. At 12:45 today, the last chart came in, and there are 2 that we haven't got. So what that speaks to is that we are right in the middle of actually still the learning curve, even in doing the best job that we could in optimizing these scenarios. Having said that, though, I think that we've learned an awful lot just from the process that we've been through, and there are a lot of things that are starting to pop out, and there's not value in running each of these scenarios 10 times and trying to get it down to the finest decimal point you can. That's not the point of this exercise. The point of this exercise is to try to understand which of these scenarios have a chance of fitting within particular budgetary guidelines, and which pieces of the scenarios actually give you either the most capability or the best, the cost effectiveness, and being able to then say, okay, well, had we been smarter, like we are now, we might have taken this vehicle to match it with this scenario. And we've done a little bit of that. The deep space attempt was actually an attempt to try to get a look at the sensitivity to the different launch vehicle options, the heavy lift options. That's why we ran this one with the 3 different launch vehicles. But there's plenty to still be learned from this in the mixing and matching, and I don't want to overstate the level of maturity of any of these.
I'd like to make 2 points. One is that our objective today is to define options, and the costs will turn out to be what the costs turn out to be.
Right.
So if we can agree on if we can agree on the options today, then we're supposed to have another 20% of our 90 days to make the cost even more accurate. Second observation is if you change the cost by 20% plus or minus, it doesn't change any of the answers that we've talked about so far. So there's no overwhelming
20% goes the right way.
Yeah.
issues here on that.
I still think when you wade through all the numbers, you've got a handful of overarching issues that come out, and this chart is always the controversial one, not because of the technical details, but because it surfaces one of the controversial issues. Your choices are spend more, do less, or do something radically different. And do something radically different is cut the fixed cost and deal with the pain. And, the reason we have groups like this have such a varied composition is there's always people who have, seen everything and know all the reasons why nothing can ever be changed. And there's, idiots like me coming in who haven't seen all that stuff yet. But, I lived through the transition of the computer industry from when everything came on big iron to when everything sat on your desk. And some of you have lived through the transition of the defense industry at the end of the Cold War. And you actually can change what the fixed costs are. It's not fun. It's not easy. But it's also not axiomatically impossible.
Also, you mentioned 3 options. There's a 4th option, is to do some of each, where at least some of 2 of the things that you said, and that probably is doable. I suspect NASA is not as efficient as it might be by a fair amount. And I also suspect that if we are going to have a really strong space program in this country, a human spaceflight program, we may have to face up to investing more in it. I think that's why we're putting together options, and we have a president to make decisions. Sally, why don't we let you go ahead?
Okay, how about the next chart? I think we've got one chart on the lunar global scenario. This also has ISS extension to 2020. It also has a commercial crew to LEO. The heavy lifter is the Ares 5 dual. It's the light, the technology development line. And I think, well, why don't we just go on to the next chart here? This is the one that came in latest, and they haven't yet been able to do the iterations to fit this. This one still looks a little bit suspicious to me, and so I think that this is a good, almost a example of what we've been doing over the last few days of saying, okay, that looks good, but some of the elements look like they might not be as well specified as they should be. So we haven't had any time with this one, but this gives you just a sense of the status of the process to date. So this one is also going to get you something. We were running these cases both with the Ares 5 dual and with the commercial buy option, again, just to see the sensitivity to the two ways of doing business, to be able to give the committee some options to think about. Next slide. The used shuttle systems, we actually have not got this chart yet. We have been through the unconstrained version, and we just ran out of time. So people are probably sitting off, trying to finish off this run right now, but we don't have this one. This case was extend the shuttle at the minimum flight rate. Norm, as I said, this was kind of your blue plate special. We close the gap. We extend ISS to 2020. We use commercial crew to LEO. This is the case where we said, if you're going to extend the shuttle, then it really does only make sense to do that if you use the shuttle-derived heavy lift. As somebody mentioned earlier, you can also run the argument backwards. It's not as strong an argument, but even if you retire the shuttle, there is some potential value in using all that infrastructure and expertise and existing workforce and facilities to build a directly shuttle-derived heavy lift vehicle. Next slide. I think we don't have a chart for that one. Mars Direct. As we were sorting out these scenarios and giving priorities to aerospace and NASA to do the costing and to do the computer runs, we realized that this one had quite a bit higher costs than some of the other scenarios, and just the results that we were seeing from some of the others, it was pretty clear that this one was going to be very, very difficult to fit even into our constrained budget. So we asked them to get to this run last of the runs, and this one is still on the list. We haven't even seen the unconstrained budget of this. I think what is true, though, just given what we've seen so far, is that a likely approach under the sort of budgets that we're talking about for a Mars First, Mars Direct would be to focus hard on robust technology development so that you could improve your capabilities and make it much more feasible to go to Mars in a different way in the future. Next slide. How about the next one? See if we actually have a summary. There we go. So I think it is what it is. We are where we are. There's more work to be done in developing the costing, but I think the more important thing is the work that needs to be done in figuring out, Norm, just as you said, the scenarios that we want to focus on in the next round of this. The important components, we really feel strongly about the technology program. We feel strongly about the commercial crew capability to get to LEO. That was one thing that fell out of these runs, that the Ares 1 Orion option was much less attractive than the commercial crew capability to LEO, and again, properly motivated and incentivized. So the $2.5 billion is to encourage a wide variety of competitors. Exploration.
Before you leave that, Sally, the data that we saw in preparing for the previous meeting showed that if you pursued some version of Ares 5, you got Ares 1 very inexpensively, quote unquote, $1.5 billion or so. Does that still look like it's true, and is there any argument there?
I think that that this is partly where the fixed costs get you. Jeff, would that be your assessment? Yeah.
So once you get it, you got to do something with it.
Well, no, it's not that. If you have all the money you could wish for, then maybe it looks like a rounding error to tack on the Ares 1 capability. When you have to start thinking about living within a budget, a vaguely realistic budget, things start to stretch out. And when they stretch out and your fixed costs are high, they cost a lot more. That's part of the problem. And the other part of the problem is, even when you look at what we're calling the less constrained scenario, what's Ares 1 for? Well, it's ultimately for bringing Orion to the ISS. But we actually haven't got a scenario in which you can get that capability before ISS is about ready to splash. If you retire ISS in 2015, you can get Ares Orion 1 in around 2016. That's not so helpful. If we extend ISS to 2020, it tends to slip the availability of Ares 1 Orion to 2020. So it's questionable whether this is a development that makes sense to do.
But if there are no human flights to LEO beyond 2020, the benefits of human rating and the expendables are that you only get a couple of years to the space station, to ISS.
Well, but we also, there's a uncertain but potentially significant cost associated with saying your large heavy lifter also has to be human rated and be a crew carrier. So in a very large number of the scenarios that we're looking at, even after the ISS ceases to continue, commercial crew services are still used to ferry the astronauts up to your exploration system, whatever that may be.
Mm-hmm.
But you could also use the Ares 1 to do that too.
You could, but now you're back to the problem that what did you do with ISS while as long as you had it?
It goes to also the cost of maintaining the operability of two federal systems, right? I mean, there's an argument that the recurring cost of the smaller vehicle is less, but there's also an argument that you basically have two programs running, two launch facilities running, two processing facilities running.
But if you don't have Ares 1, you have to maintain one of the expendables.
Not in all scenarios. In some of the scenarios, the Ares 5 Lite is human rated.
That's right.
In every scenario, either, other than the program of record, either the Ares 5 Lite is human rated or we've provided for commercial taxi to LEO.
Right. That's right. Okay, I think the points here are fairly obvious. Exploration really doesn't look viable under the FY10 budget guidance, the guidance and the run out that we've been given. Even the dash out of LEO doesn't get you anywhere, and we're still looking for that existence proof. Some things are more expensive than others. We've seen that. Deep space appears to be the most cost-effective of the exploration scenarios, and it has earlier return also. So I'm sure we'll be talking about these later on this afternoon. And some heavy lift options, other than the program of record, appear more cost-effective, though less lift capability, and they have other issues with them that we've discussed. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm eager to get off the stage.
Very well done, Sally. Thanks to you and your crew and all the folks from NASA and Aerospace who sure put in a lot of hours on that. And we've still got some more to do. Bo?
Sally, you had I thought, very useful comment before you actually got up to the podium, and that had to do with cost of operations and operability. And I've been trying to be on a campaign since I retired, trying to suggest NASA that it's worthwhile to attempt to change its design culture, so we design system not for maximum performance and minimum DVT and E cost, but design it with a little more eyesight toward the cost of operations. And I don't know how you made a similar comment. Could you say a few more words? How could we, in our report, maybe with help of our chairman, restate the recommendation to NASA that minimum DDT and E and maximum performance should perhaps not be the only criteria to avoid spending decades later of paying through your nose in terms of ops cost?
I think these charts actually show that fairly well. If you look even in the out years at the exploration programs, where we've in those cases where we've managed to achieve some capability and we're actually starting to explore, the operations costs, the fixed costs associated with operating those systems is very large. You know, the budget in the out years, with only exploration around, there's no shuttle, there's no station to blame these costs on, it's all exploration, and they're quite large. And so looking at those and seeing that those costs run out over long periods of time, the message is really clear. You should be working now to minimize those costs. You should be working to minimize the operations costs to the maximum extent possible, even if it costs you a little bit more in the development phase, even if it costs you a little bit of capability. All engineers want as much capability as they can get, and that's a good thing. All operations people want operations to be as simple as possible, and that's also a good thing. And trying to find the right mix of those is a bit of an art, and it's an art that I think we lose track of at our peril.
I think, Bo, you make a very good point, but just to be the devil's advocate, I suspect you can't, if you properly cost account, namely if you discount future costs, you can't afford to spend very much more in development to save operations costs 20 years from now. So I'm just being difficult here, but...
and that's what we always do. The only thing is that 20 years will come, and we keep paying and paying and paying, and the time value of money seems to matter little to NASA,
well, the government doesn't even discount,
yeah,
as far as I know. That reminds me, on the same kind of thing, Sally, we used I think it was you, yeah, we used 2.4% for inflation. That's double what the OMB is using. I'd sure bet on us, but the question's going to come up, where did the 2.4 come from? Do we have any authority for that?
You're not going to take the word of a physicist astronaut on the future rate of inflation?
You said you studied English, too.
Actually, one of the things that was illuminating to us is the cost of inflation that NASA uses to inflate its future costs going out. And RADS, I think that number was 2.7%. Is that right? Is RADS here? Okay. And Mike, do you know if that's right? It's 2.4 to 2.7% is the cost that NASA typically uses to take into account inflation in the out years.
See, there you have another built-in problem. OMB funds you at 1.2 if you're lucky, and NASA is putting 2.7 in.
Yeah.
And we all know it'll be 3.5.
That's right.
Fact alive. Sally, thank you. Terrific
you.
job.